37. A history and system of scripts. The verb to supplant or to compensate for supplant defines the act of writing adequately. It is the first and the last word of the chapter on scripture. We have read its opening paragraph. Here are the last lines. Words voya, not sounds sons, are written. Yet, in an inflected language, these are the sounds, the accents, and all sorts of modulations that are the main source of energy for a language, and that make a given phrase, otherwise quite ordinary, proper only to the place where it is. The means used to overcome supplement's weakness tend to make written language rather elaborately prolix, from slash of the supplement to the source, and many books written in discourse will enervate the language. To say everything as one would write it would be merely to read aloud, italics added, po 22. If supplementary is a necessarily indefinite process, writing is the supplement par excellence since it marks the point where the supplement proposes itself as supplement of supplement, sign of sign, taking the place of a speech already significant, it displaces the proper place of the sentence, the unique time of the sentence pronounced EKT by an irreplaceable subject, and in return innovates the voice. It marks the place of the initial doubling. Between these two paragraphs, 1. A very brief analysis of the diverse structures and the general growth of writing, 2. Starting from the premises of that typology and of that history. A long reflection on alphabetic writing and an appreciation of the meaning and value of writing in general. Here again, in spite of massive borrowings, history and typology remain most singular. Warburton and Condillac propose the diagram of an economic, technical, and purely objective rationality. The economic imperative must be understood here in the restrictive sense of economies to be made, of abbreviation. Writing reduces the dimensions of presence in its sign. The miniature is not reserved to illuminated capitals, it is, understood in its derivative sense, the very form of writing. The history of writing would then follow the continuous and linear progress of the techniques of abbreviation. The systems of script would derive from one another without essential modification of the fundamental structure and according to a homogeneous and monogenetic process. One script would not replace another except to gain more space and time. If one believes the project of the general history of script proposed by Condillac 13, writing does not have a different origin from that of speech, need and distance. Thus it continues the language of action. But it is at the moment that the social distance, which had led gesture to speech, increases to the point of becoming absence, that writing becomes necessary. This becoming absence of distance is not interpreted as a rupture by Condillac but described as the consequence of a continuous increase. From then on, writing has the function of reaching subjects who are not only distant but outside of the entire field of vision and beyond earshot. Why subjects? Why should writing be another name for the constitution of subjects and, so to speak, of constitution itself? Of a subject, that is to say of an individual held responsible, for, himself in front of a law and by the same token subject to that law. Under the name of writing, Condillac thinks readily of the possibility of such a subject, and of the law mastering its absence. When the field of society extends to the point of absence, of the invisible, the inaudible, and the immortal, when the local community is dislocated to the point where individuals no longer appear to one another, become capable of being imperceptible, the age of writing begins. Laws and public transactions, together with everything that deserved the attention of mankind, were multiplied to such a degree that memory was too weak for so heavy a burden, and human societies increased in such a manner that the promulgation of the laws could not, without difficulty, reach the ears of every individual. In order therefore to instruct the people, they were obliged to have recourse to some new method. Then it was that writing was invented. What progress it made I shall presently state. II. Sector 7.3, p232. When mankind had once acquired the art of communicating their conceptions by sounds, they began to feel the necessity of inventing new signs proper for perpetuating them, and for making them known to absent persons. Sector 127, p273. Since the operation of writing reproduces that of speech here, the first graphic will reflect the first speech, figure and image. It will be pictographic. Again a paraphrase of Warburton, their imaginations then represented nothing more to them than those same images, which they had already expressed by gestures and words, and which from the very beginning had rendered language figurative and metaphorical. The most natural way therefore was to delineate the images of things. To express the idea of a man or of a horse, they represented the form of each of these animals, so that the first essay towards writing was a mere picture. 14 like the first word, the first pictogram is therefore an image, both in the sense of imitative representation and of metaphoric displacement. The interval between the thing itself and its reproduction, however faithful, is traversed only by transference. The first sign is determined as an image. The idea has an essential relationship to the sign, the representative substitute of sensation. Imagination supplements attention which supplements perception. Attention may have for first effect to make those perceptions which are occasioned by their objects to continue still in the mind, when those objects are removed. II. Sector 17, po 38. Imagination permits the representation of an object in terms of a sign, by its simple name, for example. The theory of the sensible origin of ideas in general, the theory of signs and of metaphoric language which commands almost all 18th century thought, here exhibits its Cartesian critique of rationalism against an intact theological and metaphysical base. It is the original sin, functioning as did the flood in the previous examples, which makes possible and necessary the sensationalist criticism of innate ideas, the recourse to learning through signs or metaphors, speech or writing, the system of signs, accidental, natural, arbitrary. Whenever therefore I happen to say, that from slash of the supplement to the source we have no ideas but what come from the senses, it must be remembered, that I speak only of the state into which we are fallen by sin. This proposition applied to the soul before the fall, or after its separation from the body, would be absolutely false. I confine myself therefore, in the following work, to the present state of humanity, 8, p10, po 18. It is thus, as with Malebranche, for example, the very concept of experience which remains dependent on the idea of original sin. There is one law there, the notion of experience, even when one would like to use it to destroy metaphysics or speculation, continues to be, in one or another point of its functioning, fundamentally inscribed within onto theology, at least by the value of presence, whose implication it can never reduce by itself. Experience is always the relationship with the plenitude, whether it be sensory simplicity or the infinite presence of God. Even up to Hegel and Husserl, one could show, for this very reason, the complicity of a certain sensationalism and of a certain theology. The onto-theological idea of sensibility or experience, the opposition of passivity and activity, constitute a profound homogeneity, hidden under the diversity of metaphysical systems. Within that idea, absence and the sign always seem to make an apparent, provisional, and derivative notch in the system of first and last presence. They are thought as accidents and not as conditions of the desired presence. The sign is always a sign of the fall. Absence always relates to distancing from God. In order to escape the closure of the system, it is not enough to get rid of the theological hypothesis or obligation. If he denies himself the theological facilities of Condillac when he looks for the natural origin of society, speech, and writing, Rousseau makes the substitutive concepts of nature or origin play an analogous role. How can we believe that the theme of the fall is absent from this discourse? How especially when we see the disappearing finger of God appear exactly when the so-called natural catastrophe comes about? The differences between Rousseau and Condillac will always be contained within the same closure. One cannot state the problem of the model of the fall, Platonic or Judeo-Christian, except within this common closure. 15. The first writing is thus a painted image. Not that painting had served as writing, as miniature. The two were at first intermingled, a closed and mute system within which speech had as yet no right of entry and which was shielded from all other symbolic investment. There, one had nothing but a pure reflection of object or action. It is in all probability to the necessity of thus delineating our thoughts that the art of painting owes its original, and this necessity has doubtless contributed to preserve the language of action, as the easiest to represent by the pencil. Sector 128, p274j. This natural writing is thus the only universal writing. The diversity of scripts appears from the moment the threshold of pure pictography is crossed. That would be a simple origin. Condillac, following Warburton in this, engenders or rather deduces all other types and all other stages of writing out of this natural system. 16 Linear progress will always be that of condensation, and of purely quantitative condensation. More precisely, it will concern an objective quantity, natural volume and space. To this profound law are submitted all displacements and all graphic condensations that only avoid it in appearance. From this point of view, pictography, the primary method that employs one sign per thing, is the least economical. This squandering of signs is American, notwithstanding the inconveniences arising from this method. The most civilized nations in America were incapable of inventing a better. The savages of Canada have no other. Sector 129, Po 274. The superiority of hieroglyphic script picture and character depends on the fact that only a single figure is used to signify several things. pp 275, 274. Which supposes that there might be it is the function of a pictographic limit something like a unique sign for a unique thing, a supposition contradictory to the very concept and operation of the sign. To determine the first sign in this way, to found or deduce the entire system of signs with reference to a sign which does not belong to that system, is to reduce signification to presence. The sign from then on is nothing but a disposing of presences in the library. The advantage of hieroglyphs one sign for many things is reduced to the economy of libraries. That is what the more ingenious Egyptians understood. They were the first who made use of a shorter method which is known by the name of hieroglyphics. The inconveniency arising from the enormous bulk of volumes induced them to make use of only a single figure to signify several things. The forms of displacement and condensation differentiating the Egyptian system are recomprehended within this economic concept and conform to the nature of the thing, to the nature of things, which it thus suffices to consult. 3 degrees or 3 moments, the part for the whole, 2 hands, a shield, and a bow for a battle in curiologic hieroglyphs, the instrument real or metaphorical for the thing, an eye for God's knowledge, a sword for the tyrant, finally an analogous thing, in its totality, for the thing itself, a serpent and the medley of its spots for the starry heavens, in tropical hieroglyphics. According to Warburton, it was already for economic reasons that cursive or demotic hieroglyphics were substituted for hieroglyphics properly speaking or for sacred writing. Philosophy is the name of what precipitates this movement, economic corruption which desacralizes through abridging and effacing the signifier for the benefit of the signified, but it is now time to speak of an alteration, which this change of the subject and manner of expression made in the delineation of hieroglyphic from slash of the supplement to the source figures. Hitherto the animal or thing representing was drawn out graphically, but when the study of philosophy, which had occasioned symbolic writing, had inclined their learned to write much, and variously, that exact manner of delineation would be as well too tedious as too voluminous, they therefore by degrees perfected another character, which we may call the running hand of hieroglyphics, resembling the Chinese characters, which being at first formed only by the outlines of each figure, became at length a kind of marks. One natural effect that this running hand character would, in time, produce, we must not here omit to speak of, it was this, that its use would take off much of the attention from the symbol, and fix it on the thing signified by it, by which means the study of symbolic writing would be much abbreviated, there being then little to do, but to remember the power of the symbolic mark, whereas before, the properties of the thing or animal, used as a symbol, were to be learned, in a word. It would reduce this writing to the present state of the Chinese. 139-40, Warburton, P115J. This effacement of the signifier led by degrees to the alphabet, cf. pp. 125-26, pages 10-11. This is also Condillic's conclusion, sector 134. It is therefore the history of knowledge of philosophy which, tending to multiply books, pushes toward formalization, abbreviation, algebra. By the same movement, separating itself from the origin, the signifier is hollowed and desacralized, demotized, and universalized. The history of writing, like the history of science, would circulate between the two epochs of universal writing, between two simplicities, between two forms of transparence and univocity, an absolute pictography doubling the totality of the natural entity in an unrestrained consumption of signifiers, and an absolutely formal graphy reducing the signifying expense to almost nothing. There would be no history of writing and of knowledge. One might simply say no history at all except between these two poles. And if history is not thinkable except between these two limits, one cannot disqualify the mythologies of universal script pictography or algebra without suspecting the concept of history itself. If one has always thought the contrary, opposing history to the transparence of true language, it was no doubt through a blindness toward the archaeological or eschatological limits, starting from which the concept of history was formed. Science, what Warburton and Condillic call philosophy here the episteme and eventually self-knowledge, consciousness, would therefore be the movement of idealization, and algebraizing, depoetizing formalization whose operation is to repress in order to master it be either the charged signifier or the linked hieroglyph. That this movement makes it necessary to pass through the logocentric stage is only an apparent paradox. The privilege of the logos is that of phonetic writing, of a writing provisionally more economical, more algebraic, by reason of a certain condition of knowledge. The epoch of logocentrism is a moment of the global effacement of the signifier. One then believes one is protecting and exalting speech, one is only fascinated by a figure of the technique. By the same token, one scorns phonetic writing because it has the advantage of assuring greater mastery in being effaced, in translating an oral signifier in the best possible way for a more universal and more convenient time. Phonic auto-affection, dispensing with all exterior recourses, permits, at a certain epoch of the history of the world and of what one calls man, the greatest possible mastery, the greatest possible self-presence of life, the greatest possible liberty. It is this history, as epoch not of history but as history, which is closed at the same time as the form of being of the world that is called knowledge. The concept of history is therefore the concept of philosophy and of the episteme. Even if it was only belatedly imposed upon what is called the history of philosophy, it was invoked there since the beginning of that adventure. It is in a sense unheard of until now. All idealist, or conventionally Hegelian follies of an analogous appearance notwithstanding that history is the history of philosophy. Or if one prefers, here Hegel's formula must be taken literally, history is nothing but the history of philosophy, absolute knowledge is fulfilled. What exceeds this closure is nothing, neither the presence of being, nor meaning, neither history nor philosophy, but another thing which has no name, which announces itself within the thought of this closure and guides our writing here. A writing within which philosophy is inscribed as a place within a text which it does not command. Philosophy is, within writing, nothing but this movement of writing as effacement of the signifier and the desire of presence restored, of being, signified in its brilliance and its glory. The evolution and properly philosophic economy of writing go therefore in the direction of the effacing of the signifier, whether it take the form of forgetting or repression. Whether opposed or associated, these two last concepts are equally inadequate. At any rate, forgetfulness, if one understands it as the effacement of the power of retention by finitude, is the very possibility of repression. And repression, that without which dissimulation would have no meaning. The concept of repression is thus, at least as much as that of forgetting, the product of a philosophy, of meaning. Whatever it might be, the movement of the retreat of the signifier, the perfecting of writing, would free attention and consciousness, knowledge and self-knowledge as idealization of the mastered object, for the presence of the signified. The latter is all the more available because it is ideal. And the value of truth in general, which always implies the presence of the signified, aletheia or adequatio, far from dominating this movement and allowing it to be thought, is only one of its epochs, however privileged. A European epoch within the growth of the sign, and even, as Nietzsche, who wrenches Warburton's proposition from its environment and its metaphysical security, would say, of the abbreviation of signs. So from slash of the supplement to the source that, let it be said in parenthesis, in wishing to restore a truth and an originary or fundamental ontology in the thought of Nietzsche, one risks misunderstanding, perhaps at the expense of everything else, the axial intention of his concept of interpretation. Repeating Warburton's and Condillic's statement outside its closure, one may say that the history of philosophy is the history of prose, or rather of the becoming prose of the world. Philosophy is the invention of prose. Philosophy speaks prose, less in excluding the poet from the city than in writing. In necessarily writing that philosophy in which the philosopher has long believed, not knowing what he was doing, and not knowing that a most convenient writing permitted him to do it, and that by rights he could have even satisfied to speak it. In his chapter on the origin of poetry, Condillic calls it a fact, at length the philosopher, incapable of bending to the rules of poetry, was the first who ventured to write in prose, sector 67, Po 229. He is writing of three sides of the Isle of Sires, the first we know of who wrote in prose. Writing in the colloquial sense is by itself prosaic. It is prose. On that point too Rousseau is different from Condillac. When writing appears, one no longer needs rhythm and rhyme whose function is, according to Condillac, to engrave meaning within memory, ibid. Before writing, poetry will 1d in some way be a spontaneous engraving, a writing before the fact. Intolerant of poetry, philosophy would have taken writing to be a fact. It is difficult to appreciate what separates Rousseau from Warburton and Condillac here, and to determine the value of the rupture. On the one hand, Rousseau seems to refine the models which he borrows. Genetic derivation is no longer linear or causal. He is more attentive to the structures of the systems of writing in their relationship to social or economic systems and to the figures of passion. The appearance of forms of writing is relatively independent of the rhythms of the history of languages. The models of explication are in appearance less theological. The economy of writing refers to motivations other than those of neat addition, understood in a homogeneous, simplistic, and objectivistic sense. But on the other hand, he neutralizes what is irreducibly economic in the system of Warburton and Condillac. And we know how the ruses of theological reason work within his discourse. Let us approach his text. To the technical and economic imperatives of objective space, Rousseau's explication makes only one concession. It is in order discreetly to correct Warburton's and Condillac's simplism. It is a matter of writing by furrows. The furrow is the line, as the ploughman traces it, the road by rough broken by the ploughshare. The furrow of agriculture, we remind ourselves, opens nature to culture, cultivation. And one also knows that writing is born with agriculture which happens only with sedentarization. How does the ploughman proceed? Economically. Arrived at the end of the furrow, he does not return to the point of departure. He turns ox and plow around. And proceeds in the opposite direction. Saving of time, space, and energy. Improvement of efficiency and reduction of working time. Writing by the turning of the ox post on writing by furrows was a movement in linear and phonographic script. Point 17 at the end of the line traveled from left to right, one resumes from right to left. Why was it abandoned at a given moment by the Greeks, for example? \vh Why did the economy of the writer's scripture break with that of the ploughman? Why is the space of the one not the space of the other? If space were objective, geometric, ideal, no difference in economy would be possible between the two systems of incision. But the space of geometric objectivity is an object or an ideal signified produced at a moment of writing. Before it, there is no homogeneous space, submitted to one and the same type of technique and economy. Before it, space orders itself wholly for the habitation and inscription in itself of the body proper. There still are factors of heterogeneity inside a space to which one and the same proper body relates, and therefore there are different, indeed incompatible, economic imperatives, among which one must choose and among which sacrifices and an organization of hierarchies become necessary. Thus, for example, the surface of a page, the expanse of parchment or any other receptive substance distributes itself differently according to whether it is a matter of writing or reading. An original economy is prescribed each time. In the first case, and during an entire technological era, it had to order itself according to the system of the hand. In the second case, and during the same epoch, to the system of the eye. In both cases, it is a matter of a linear and oriented path, the orientation of which is not indifferent and reversible in a homogeneous milieu. In a word, it is more convenient to read than to write by furrows. The visual economy of reading obeys a law analogous to that of agriculture. The same thing is not true of the manual economy of writing, and the latter was predominant during a specific era and period of the great phonographic linear epoch. The fashion outlives the conditions of its necessity, it continued till the age of printing. Our writing and our reading are still largely determined by the movement of the hand. The printing press has not yet liberated the organization of the surface from its immediate servitude to the manual gesture, and to the tool of writing. Rousseau, therefore, was already astonished. At first the Greeks adopted not only the characters of the Phoenicians, but also the direction of their lines from right to left. Later it occurred to them to proceed as the ploughman, that is, writing alternately from left to right and right to left. Finally, they wrote according to our present practice of starting from slash of the supplement to the source each line from left to right. This development is quite natural. Writing in the furrow fashion is undoubtedly the most comfortable to read. I am even surprised that it did not become the established practice with printing, but, being difficult to write manually, it had to be abandoned as manuscripts multiplied. Essay, p20 The space of writing is thus not an originarily intelligible space. It begins however to become so from the origin, that is to say from the moment when writing, like all the work of signs, produces repetition, and therefore ideality in that space. If one calls reading that moment which comes directly to double the originary writing, one may say that the space of pure reading is always already intelligible, that of pure writing always still sensible. Provisionally, we understand these words inside metaphysics. But the impossibility of separating writing and reading purely and simply disqualifies this opposition from the beginning of the game. Maintaining it for convenience, let us nevertheless say that the space of writing is purely sensible, in the sense that Kant intended, space irreducibly oriented within which the left does not recover the right. One must also take into account the prevalence of one direction over the other within the movement. For here it is the question of an operation, not just of a perception. The two sides are never symmetrical from the point of view of the appetite or simply the activity of the body proper. Thus the return of the ox is less suitable for writing than reading. Between these two economic prescriptions the solution will be a label compromise which will leave residues, entail inequalities of development and useless expenses. Compromise, if one wishes, between the eye and the hand. During the age of this transaction, one does not only write, one reads a little blindly, guided by the order of the hand. Should one still recall everything that such an economic necessity made possible? This compromise is already very derivative, a late arrival, if one remembers that it prevails only at a moment when a certain type of writing, itself charged with history, was already practiced, linear phonography. The system of speech, of hearing oneself speak, auto-affection that seems to suspend all borrowing of signifiers from the world and thus to render itself universal and transparent to the signified, the phone which seems to guide the hand, was never able to precede its system nor, in its very essence, to be alien to it. It could only represent itself as order and predominance of a temporal linearity by seeing itself or rather handling itself, within its own self-reading. It is not enough to say that the eye or the hand speak. Already, within its own representation, the voice is seen and maintained. The concept of linear temporality is only one way of speech. This form of successivity is in return imposed upon the phone, upon consciousness, and upon preconsciousness from a certain determined space of its inscription. For the voice is always already invested, undone solicity, required, and marked in its essence by a certain spatiality. Point 18 When I say a form is imposed, I obviously do not think of any classical model of causality. The question, so often asked, of knowing if one writes as one speaks or speaks as one writes, if one reads as one writes or conversely, refers in its finality to an historical or prehistoric depth more hidden than is generally suspected. Finally, if one notes that the place OF writing is linked, as Rousseau had intuited, to the nature OF social space, to the perceptive and dynamic organization of the technical, religious, economic, and other such spaces, one realizes the difficulty of a transcendental question on space. A new transcendental aesthetic must let itself be guided not only by mathematical idealities but by the possibility of inscriptions in general, not befalling an already constituted space as a contingent accident but producing the spatiality of space. Indeed we say of inscription in general, in order to make it quite clear that it is not simply the notation of a prepared speech representing itself, but inscription within speech and inscription as habitation always already situated. Such a questioning, in spite of its reference to a form of fundamental passivity, ought no longer to call itself a transcendental aesthetic, neither in the Kantian, nor in the Husserlian, sense of those words. A transcendental question on space concerns the prehistoric and precultural level of spatio-temporal experience which furnishes a unitary and universal ground for all subjectivity, and all culture, this side of empirical diversity, as well as the orientations proper to their spaces and their times. Now if one lets oneself be guided by inscription as habitation in general, the Husserlian radicalization of a Kantian question is indispensable but insufficient. We know that Husserl reproached Kant for having allowed himself to be guided in his question by ideal objects already constituted into a science, geometry or mechanics. To a constituted ideal space a subjectivity constituted, into faculties, corresponded naturally. And from my present point of view, there is much to say on the concept of the line which so often intervenes in the Kantian critique. Time, the form of all sensible phenomena, internal and external, seems to dominate space, the form of external sensible phenomena, but it is a time that one may always represent by a line, and the refutation of idealism will reverse that order. The Husserlian project not only put all objective space of science within parenthesis, it had to articulate aesthetics upon a transcendental kinesthetics. Nevertheless, in spite of the Kantian revolution and the discovery of pure sensibility, free of all reference to sensation, to the extent that the concept of sensibility, as pure passivity, and its contrary will continue to dominate such questions, they will remain imprisoned in metaphysics. If the space-time that we inhabit is a priori the space-time of the trace, there is neither pure activity nor pure passivity. This pair of concepts, and we know that Husserl erased one with the from slash of the supplement to the source other constantly belongs to the myth of the of an uninhabited world, of a world alien to the trace, pure presence of the pure present, that one may either call purity of life or purity of death, determination of being which has always superintended not only theological and metaphysical but also transcendental questions, whether conceived in terms of scholastic theology, or in a Kantian and post-Kantian sense. The Husserlian project of a transcendental aesthetics, of a restoration of the logos of the aesthetic world, formal and transcendental logic, asterisk remains subjected to the instance of the living present, as to the universal and absolute form of experience. It is by what complicates this privilege and escapes it that we are open to the space of inscription. Breaking with linear genesis and describing the correlations among systems of script, social structures, and the figures of passion, Rousseau opens his questions in the direction that I have indicated. 3 states of man in society, 3 systems of writing, 3 forms of social organization, 3 types of passion. These 3 ways of writing correspond almost exactly to 3 different stages according to which one can consider men gathered into a nation essay, p16j. Among these 3 matters, there are no DOLT differences of crudity and antiquity, but inasmuch as they can assure a chronological and linear localization, they interest Rousseau but little. Many systems may coexist, a cruder system may appear after a more refined system. Here too all begins with painting. That is to say with savagery, the primitive way of writing was not to represent sounds, but objects themselves. Is this painting satisfied with reproducing the thing? Does it correspond to that universal proto-writing that redoubles nature without any displacement? Here the first complication is introduced. In effect Rousseau distinguishes between 2 pictographies. One proceeds directly and the other allegorically, whether directly as with the Mexicans, or by allegorical imagery, as previously the Egyptians did po 17. And when he links them thus, this stage corresponds to passionate language, and already supposes some society and some needs to which the passions have given birth, he do not designate the sole Egyptian or allegorical state with any verisimilitude, without which it would be necessary to conclude that a writing direct pictography could have existed in a society without passion, which is contrary to the premises of the essay. On the other hand, how should one imagine a direct, proper, unallegorical painting in a state of passion? That too is contrary to the premises. One cannot overcome this alternative without reinstating something unsaid. Pure representation without metaphoric displacement, the purely reflecting kind of painting, is the first figure. In it the thing most faithfully represented is already no longer properly present. The project of repeating the thing already corresponds to a social passion and therefore requires a metaphoricity, an elementary transference. One transports the thing within its double, that is to say already within an ideality, for another, and the perfect representation is always already other than what it doubles and represents. Allegory begins there. Direct painting is already allegoric and impassioned. That is why there is no true writing. The duplication of the thing in the painting, and already in the brilliance of the phenomenon where it is present, guarded and regarded, maintained, however slightly, facing the regard and under the regard, opens appearance as the absence of the thing in itself, sameness proper and its truth. There is never a painting of the thing itself, and first of all because there is no thing itself. If we suppose that writing had a primitive and pictorial stage, it would emphasize this absence, this evil, or this resource which forever shapes and undermines the truth of the phenomenon, produces it and of course substitutes it. The original possibility of the image is the supplement, which adds itself without adding anything to fill an emptiness which, within fullness, begs to be replaced. Writing as painting is thus at once the evil and the remedy within the famous or the eidos. Plato already said that the art or technique, of writing was a pharmakon, drug or tincture, salutary or maleficent. And the disquieting part of writing had already been experienced in its resemblance to painting. Writing is like painting, like the zoography, which is itself determined, cf. Critolus, 430-32, within a problematic of mimesis, resemblance is troubling, I cannot help feeling, Phaedrus, that writing is unfortunately like painting, zoographia, 27-5d. Here painting zoography betrays being and speech, words, and things themselves because it freezes them. Its offshoots seem to be living things but when one questions them, they no longer respond. Zoography has brought death. The same goes for writing. No one, and certainly not the father, is there when one questions. Rousseau would approve without reservations. Writing carries death. One could play on this, writing as zoography as that painting of the living which stabilizes animality, is, according to Rousseau, the writing of savages, who are also, as we know, only hunters, men of the zoography, of the capture of the living. Writing would indeed be the pictorial representation of the hunted beast, magical capture and murder. Another difficulty in this concept of proto-writing, no recourse to convention is made there. The latter appears only in the second way, moment of barbarism and of the ideogram. The hunter paints beings, the shepherd already inscribes languages, the second way is to represent words and propositions by conventional characters. That can be done only when the language is completely formed and an entire people is united by common laws, for this already presupposes a twofold convention. Such is the from slash of the supplement to the source writing of the Chinese, it truly represents sounds and speaks to the eyes essay, p17. One may conclude from this that, in the first state, metaphor did not give rise to any convention. Allegory was still a savage production. There was no need of institutions to represent beings themselves, and metaphor here was the transition between nature and institution. Then the proto-writing which did not paint language but painted things could make shift with the language, therefore with a society which was not at all completely formed. This first stage is always that unstable limit of birth, one has left pure nature but one has not completely reached the state of society. The Mexicans and the Egyptians would have the right, according to Rousseau, to only some society. The second manner paints sounds but without splitting up words and propositions. It would thus be idiophonographic. Each signifier would refer to a phonic totality and a conceptual synthesis, to a complex and global unity of sense and sound. One has not yet attained purely phonographic writing, of the alphabetic types, for example, in which the visible signifier refers to a phonic unity which in itself has no sense. It is perhaps for this reason that the ideophonogram presupposes a twofold convention, that which links the grapheme to its phonomatic signified, and that which links this phonomatic signified, as a signifier, to its signified sense, to its concept, if one wishes. But in that context, twofold convention might also mean it is less probable something else, linguistic and social convention. That can be done only when the language is completely formed and an entire people is united by common laws. One does not need institutional laws for being understood through the paintings of things and of natural beings, but one needs them for stabilizing the rules of the painting of sounds and of the unity of words and ideas. However, Rousseau calls barbaric the nations capable of these common laws and this twofold convention. The use of the concept of barbarity in the essay is very disconcerting. Often, in chapters 4 and 9, Rousseau makes it function in a perfectly deliberate, rigorous, and systematic way. 3 states of society, 3 languages, 3 scripts, savage/barbaric/civil, hunter/shepherd/loveman, pictography/idiophonography/analytical phonography. Yet elsewhere, an apparently looser use of the word, certainly of the word barbarity if not of barbaric, designates again a state of dispersion, whether it be of pure nature or of domestic structure. Note 2 of chapter 9 calls savages those whose barbarity is subsequently described. Apply these ideas to primitive men and you will see the reason for their barbarity. These barbaric times were a golden age, not because men were united, but because they were separated. Scattered over the vast wilderness of the world, men would relapse into the stupid barbarism in which they would be if they were born of the earth. Essay, pp. 33, 36j. Domestic barbaric society had no language. Familial idiom is not a language. Living almost without society, widely scattered, hardly speaking at all, how could they write? Is not this sentence in flagrant contradiction with the attribution, in chapter end of a script and even of a twofold convention to barbaric peoples? No commentary can, it seems, efface this contradiction. An interpretation may attempt it. It would consist, uncovering a profound level of literality while neutralizing another one more superficial, of searching then within Rousseau's text for the right to isolate relatively the structure of the graphic system from the structure of the social system. Although the social and graphic types correspond ideally and by analogy, a society of the civil type may have in fact a writing of the barbaric type. Although barbarians hardly speak and do not write, one finds the characteristics of a certain writing within barbarity. In saying thus that the depicting of objects is appropriate to a savage people, signs of words and of propositions, to a barbaric people, and the alphabet to civilized peoples. Publius Police's essay, p17j, one does not contravene the structural principle, rather one confirms it. In our society, where the civil type has appeared, the elements of pictographic writing would be savage, the idiophonographic elements barbaric. And who would deny the presence of all these elements in our practice of writing? For even while maintaining the principle of structural analogy, Rousseau insists nonetheless on preserving the relative independence of social, linguistic, and graphic structures. He will say it further on, the art of writing does not at all depend upon that of speaking. It derives from needs of a different kind which develop earlier or later according to circumstances entirely independent of the duration of the people, and which might never have occurred in very old nations. Po 19j. The fact of the appearance of writing is therefore not necessary. And it is this empirical contingency which allows the putting in parenthesis of the fact in structural or eidetic analysis. That a structure whose internal organization and essential necessity we know should appear in fact here or there, sooner or later, is, as I have noted elsewhere, the condition and the limit of a structural analysis as such and in its proper moment. In its proper instance, attention to the internal specificity of the organization always leaves to chance the passage from one structure to another. This chance may be thought, as it is here the case, negatively as catastrophe, or affirmatively as play. This structuralist limit and power has an ethico-metaphysical convenience. Writing in general, as the emergence of a new system of inscription, is a supplement of which one would wish to learn only the additive aspect. It happens unexpectedly, at a stroke servant uncuj, into the bargain, and the noxious influence arrives ill-advisedly, in addi from / malvenu, and plus, from the exterior, when nothing in the conditions of its past made it necessary. Not to attribute any necessity to its historical appearance is at once to ignore the appeal of substitution and to think evil as a surprising, exterior, irrational, accidental and therefore effaceable addition.